Activation warning. This episode contains explicit and graphic descriptions of suicide, self-harm, sexual assault, and rape. Discretionary caution and action is required. This episode is not for children. Please use extreme self-care in listening to this episode and seek immediate help through the National Suicide Hotline by dialing 988 if you are emotionally activated or triggered by the content of this episode. Or if you are activated and need help from the National Sexual Assault Telephone Hotline, call 1-800-656-HOPE. That's 1-800-656-4673.
It was never in the context of, are you okay? It was, how dare you? It was like, you are a monster. This is your fault. You're going to destroy the family image. I'm going to lose my license as being a teacher. Your father's going to lose his security clearance. You're going to pull this family apart.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I'm glad you're here. You've just tuned into one of the most important podcasts that you may ever listen to, because the purpose of this podcast is to provide a safe space for victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault to share their stories and connect with others who've been through similar experiences. However, there are other important aspects to this podcast: community, education, and support. I believe that sharing our stories is one of the most important steps to healing, and my hope is that the SAS podcast will help victims and survivors feel less alone and more empowered. And my ultimate goal is to provide all of my listeners with insights, resources, and a supportive space where empathy, compassion, and understanding thrive. My commitment is to being there for all my listeners. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and I'm here each week talking to victims and survivors or interviewing experts and professionals in order to not only gain insights and information to help us on our healing path, but also to provide an education on being trauma-informed, working to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Whether you're aware of it or not, we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. So I encourage everyone to listen to this podcast. Whatever your experience is with rape or sexual assault, you are not alone, and we are all here for each other. Thank you again for being here. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. This is episode 97, and this week, my guest is someone I've shared the microphone with before, David Weeks. David participated in a roundtable episode I hosted for the Jan Broberg Show, and this week he joins me for a solo interview. David experienced trauma most of his growing up years, including sexual assault, rape, emotional and physical abuse. Yet today he is pursuing his master's degree and is deeply concerned for the youth of our society in keeping them safe from the same types of abuses he endured. This episode is one that will inform and inspire, and I'm glad you're here to listen in. Here's David. David Weeks, it's great to have you here on Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. I am so grateful for your willingness to be here and talk about your experience.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's always a gift to be able to tell my story and help others with it.
If you don't mind, I'd love for you to tell the audience about yourself. Give us some history and some of your educational background, any part of your life experience that you think would help in explaining to the audience who you are.
My name is David Weeks. I was born and raised in Virginia. Lived there most of my life. Currently moved to pursue grad school, and that has been a journey of itself. I have a background in psychology that I use to help educate and inform people about abuse and how it impacts the nervous system, as well as to help break the stigma of abuse and how trauma impacts us.
I'm so glad you mentioned that's part of your goal, because that's a very important part of this podcast. David, what are you able to tell us about your sexual assault experience?
So I'll start where it all started for me. I was about 4 years old when I was first enduring abuse from my family. The first memory I have really is my father telling my mom I can't handle him anymore and walking out of the house with my sister. That memory for me was so profound because it was the first memory I have of being abandoned, where the hypervigilance really started to set in as like my grandmother and mother were having some conversation in the kitchen, and I knew at a young age just to stay silent and not to create any noise. It's like to freeze. I think that abandonment piece really impacted me. Our attachment really develops at the age of 3. And so I don't know what happened before that because I don't have memories of that. But from what I've gathered from my father, who I'm still in contact with, it was a very much a controlled environment. There was a lot of, I think, hostile energy between my mother and father. And so I definitely, as children, we definitely absorb the environment around us, and our bodies are hardwired to survive. So I think that really much impacted me. And my father ended up leaving my mother when I was still 4, and having that primary caregiver, now absent from my life, not really knowing where he went, I think was also very traumatic for me. It led to my mother remarrying to my stepfather, who I am pretty confident that he does have antisocial personality disorder or some realm of at least malignant narcissism. Either way, it's definitely not a kind person, to say the least. I really do blame my mom for marrying him because she was supposed to protect us. And I know my mom was abused as a kid. There's a lot of intergenerational abuse in my family. Both my grandmothers were abused on their side. My grandfather on my mom's side was abused. And so I think my family didn't really know how to love and what it is to love and feel safe in the same breath and not feel like you're on eggshells. And I think my mom is anxiously attached, and she needed someone to fill that void who was left by my father leaving. And so the person she ended up marrying was my next door neighbor. And from what I remember, they got married pretty fast. I would say within about a year. And so it kind of changed the course of my life for sure. He ended up going on deployment shortly after. And I don't remember how long he was on deployment. I just know he was gone for a long period of time. And I, quote unquote, became the man of the house. And I felt a lot of pressure and feeling the absence of a male figure in the house, even at a young age. I definitely could see my mom was lost with not having him around. I was able to read my environment very well, even as a kid. My mom went to go say she was going to excuse herself to the bathroom at dinner. I knew she was really going upstairs to cry, and I would really be the one to calm her down. Of course, no one's giving me that in return. It's all one way to her. I really became, I guess, like a lot of different parts to a lot of different people. And growing up was very much being a chameleon and learning how to adapt to your environment. My mom ended up attaching to me. Um, and I think at any age, really, it feels good to be put on a pedestal, but pedestals eventually collapse and the fall is a long way down. For me, my mom would take me on these dates. We would have date night where my sisters wouldn't have that. And it made me uncomfortable knowing that my sisters weren't receiving the same amount of, I guess, attention, because I was always the one who wanted to make everyone happy and making sure everyone is okay. Even at a young age, I'm still like that. And so I didn't like how my sisters were being treated, and I could see them resenting me for receiving special treatment, because my mom would always say, your brother's not doing that. Like, why can't you be more like your brother? And so I didn't like that at all. And we would also, she would cuddle me at night. And there were times where I did feel really uncomfortable, almost like as I got older and really reprocessed what happened, I really felt like I was her boyfriend in a way at the age of 6. I just remember feeling not safe. Like I wanted her, like, to push her away when she was cuddling me sometimes. It felt like the room was getting smaller. My stepfather eventually came back into my life, and I was almost immediately discarded for him. Our time together started dwindling. We didn't really go on these dinner dates anymore. We really, I guess, stopped cohesively acting of what's somewhat of a functional and dysfunctional family parenting. It was very much pleasing him, and I feel like the kids were really put on the back burner for a long time. My stepfather, he was in the military, so he was a senior chief, so he was high ranking, and he really did treat us like cadets, like very standardized attention. Everything needs to be done when I say it. I don't want to come home to anything where I have to do it. We always did the chores, right? But he didn't do anything. He would come home from work, like lay down. I guess he would do yard work, but even when I got older, I started kind of taking care of that. So he very much had an absent way of parenting. You never wanted to be on the receiving end of his rage, because when he did have these raging spells, he would be yelling at you to the point where your ears were ringing, almost like a bear's coming at you, but you can't really run because there's nowhere to go because you're a kid. I was very much discarded for him. There was a time where my stepfather was kind to me. I think it was more of, look, I'm nice to your kids, to really win my mother over. I never heard him say once, I love you. I always was the one telling him that I love you. Never got that back in return. I guess you could very much say the parent and child roles were very much reversed. It really taught me to be hyper independent, and it's still, I guess, something I'm still working through in therapy today. Now, I'm guessing at the age of about like 7 now, my going through a custody battle with my biological father, because he never really fully lived our lives. He was still somewhat present, even if it was from afar. My mom's a narcissist, and so she knew that he wanted kids. And again, like, she used the court system very much to punish him. Even though I can't really say if she wanted us to have the kids. I just know that she didn't want him to have us. Very much did the classical thing in the court system where they like filed every single motion, drew the court out to like drain his assets, because she was being funded by my grandfather, who, being a chemical engineer, you're not hurting for money in that profession. So yeah, so like that happened. I guess I really call it child pass along, the custody. And like I tell my therapist now, I very much felt like property, where like I would stay at one house through the week, and on the weekends my father would get me. And so there was really no, I guess, way of forming friendships outside of school, because I was either with my mom or I was with my father. I was younger, so it affected my older than me a little bit more, as she was entering, I guess, more middle school ages, and I was still in elementary school. As a child, I really wanted a stable environment. I didn't like having to go to and from every single time. It was very overwhelming, to say the least. And I was also very sick growing up because I had epilepsy. I had all the tests done with the EEGs and looking like an alien from Mars. So, which is what I call it. And I think in that way, I really did feel different from the other kids, because there wasn't other kids I knew of running around with a bandana on their head with wires coming out of a backpack. I very much felt different. Even when my mom kind of discarded me from my stepfather, I did receive, I would say, more attention than my other sisters, because I was so sick with epilepsy. I think my longest seizure I had was 7 minutes, which is an incredibly long seizure. Most of them last 30 seconds to a minute. Fortunately, I grew out of epilepsy. That attention eventually started going away as I got older, and I started really coming into my own. When I was in third grade, though, I guess the depressive disorder that I have now really all started. My father was arrested. He was arrested for wanting to murder the family he just married into, and allegedly me and my sister. It took, let's say, over a decade to really find the truth, but that was a version of what my mom told me as, a third grader. I remember we came back from seeing Octoman, Like 10 minutes later, my mom gets a call. She sits us all down, just saying your father's been arrested for wanting to murder you two and his new family. I don't really know how she thought that was an appropriate thing to tell a third grader because I did not have the language or the emotional capacity to deal with that. It very much, I guess, started the dark path for me where I did have major depressive episodes where I was crying. I guess having a personality change where I was crying during recess or random times during the day because my father was arrested for wanting to kill me. Losing that safety in the world, knowing, I guess, someone wants you dead. I couldn't understand really what was going on. And then I was told that my father got released because of good behavior. He never went to prison. He was in jail. That's not what I was told as a kid. And I was like, well, now shoot, my father, who's out of jail now, like who's going to protect me? Yeah, it was very twisted and it was very much indoctrinating me and my sister against him. I would say when my father got arrested, it was really the last time I saw my grandmother and my grandfather and my uncle on my dad's side. And it took me about over a decade for me to see them again because I was prevented from having any relationship with them. It's been hard getting to know them because they're very different from my family. They're very compassionate and kind people. And when you've been abused for so long, it feels like a threat. It feels like, okay, this is dangerous. It feels really uncomfortable. Like, what are you trying to get from me? Which is something I'm still working on, being able to receive love. Shortly after my father got arrested, I also started puberty when I was still in the third grade. So I was 7, starting puberty when most boys start at 11, maybe 12. I was never put on hormone blockers. I was having hair at 8. Everything for me was very accelerated for me. Nothing was ever explained to me what was happening with my body. Even like we call it sex ed, wasn't really doing a good job because I was already like ahead of that, of what was happening. I was like, okay, that's old information to me. And so I had to really teach myself how growing up being a man, still at a very young age. I was afraid to also speak out just of the sheer fear of my parents and anything I did that was quote unquote misbehaving would go to my doctor I was seeing and my prescriptions would be changed. So I was constantly having my medication changed. I never really developed without stimulants and SRI medication, which is used to treat ADHD and mood disorders. I was on 60 milligrams of Vyvanse and 200 milligrams of sertraline. Even when I wanted to cry, I couldn't cry because I was so drugged that I physically couldn't cry. And I really had no personality to myself. I was really robotic, which is what my mom wanted for me to be this perfect little narcissistic supply to her to get the admiration and validation as she wanted because her kids could never self individuate. Most of my life, I was raised in social isolation and I would be grounded for long periods of time. With everything going on with my father, interacting with other people seemed scary. I was good at making friends. I was not good at keeping them because, I didn't really have a means of communicating with them. I didn't have a phone. My phone would be taken away from me for months to years at a time. We didn't have a landline anymore. It's a pain that I can't really describe unless you've been in that situation. For me, the social isolation, my soul was being tortured. The need for connection and to be seen and to attach, which is significant for children, I wasn't able to get that. I think we very much live in a society that blames children and not the parent of, oh, the kids are just seeking attention. By design, kids are supposed to seek attention. That's what their nervous systems are trying to do, to feel seen and validated from their caregivers. And when they don't get that, they will look for it in other places, which is what I came to. I didn't really have a lot of friends growing up. Even the friends that I did have, I would really consider them to be healthy relationships. It was very much one-sided of me trying to make it work with these friends. The one friend that I had that was close to would always fight and make up and fight and make up. And I guess it really enforced that trauma bond that I had with my parents. Of course, no one's telling me what a healthy relationship looks like because I'm not even having that mirrored by my parents. I really much felt like a hollow shell of a person at a young age because of the social isolation. On top of that, my mom's telling me regularly, no one loves you. You need me more than I need you. If you don't like it, leave. And as a child, if I don't like it, where am I going? I can't just go on a train and be like, oh, I want a new family. Like that doesn't happen. And so what did I did? I assimilated to what was going on, and I had to bury myself because showing myself wasn't safe. I think that really came into play when I was having these sexual experiences. I remember it kind of all started for me. We're watching this rated R movie. Of course, nothing's ever being explained to us because that's the kind of parents they are. We're seeing a sex scene. I'm like 11, halfway by now. Nothing's being explained to me. I'm like, okay, what's the sex tape? So then, of course, of every curious boy, I look online, what's a sex tape? And I have all of these pornography stuff showing up to me. Not knowing what it was, I guess, made it more intriguing. I was like, oh, what's this? And then like it kind of just like evolved into something where this pornography became a place of understanding of what intimacy is supposed to look like. You're told people who love each other have sex at a young age. I'm like, okay, these people must love each other. And also being a gay man, having feelings I didn't really understand, made me very vulnerable. And trying to find, I guess, someone to validate what I was feeling and the emotions I had was okay to have and wasn't a crime to be gay because I was raised Catholic. And so, like I said, there was a lot of a perfect storm, I call it, to really what led to my sex trafficking. So I am now entering, I guess, 12, which kind of really all starts. I start porn kind of turns into now contacting people online and trying to start a community of people who are gay. I guess to talk to other gay people because no one that I know of my ages that I know is having feelings for the same sex. A lot of the part is I didn't really know how much danger I was really in when I was entering these groups and talking to these people. Of course, wanting attention, wanting affection from someone, and also being so confused about my sexuality really allowed these people to manipulate me, be obedient to them. Started talking to this guy. We started really, it took, I would say, over the course of 2 weeks, we were talking. And so I didn't know then, but I know now, like he was grooming me and trying to earn my trust. For me, I was always taught that adults were safe. And so I was like, okay, like this person, I guess, is trustworthy because he's an adult. And I didn't know he was older. It was so twisted because like I wasn't really necessarily going on these sites to have sex. It was morely just to have, I think of more than anything to have a friend because of I'm being raised in social isolation. And so he ended up earning my trust and he said he would pick me up. And so he picked me up and he drove me back to his place and not really knowing the danger I was in, still thinking, oh, we're just going to like have a conversation. We're just going to talk. The front part of my mind, I guess the thought of having sex went past my mind. I was like, well, maybe if I was like, no, like, I don't think he would have sex with me, like, because he knows better. He's an adult. And so we get to his house and I can feel his hand on my thigh. I knew at that point, I was like, oh goodness, what is he doing? And feeling the seatbelt just being tighter and tighter. And we ended up going to his place. We have a conversation, and then he asked me to take my clothes off and have him fall to the bedroom, and where he then rapes me. The whole time I'm shaking of fear, like fearing for my life. I've never really felt that situation before. It's almost like shaking like it's 30 degrees out, but you're not cold. Like just having so much cortisol being like pumped through my body. I guess time really stopped for me and it felt like an eternity almost. For me, I think a lot of the parts of the time, a lot of the time I have shamed myself because there was a part of me that was aroused. It still is something I am working on, but just because I was aroused doesn't mean I was enjoying it, which I think is something that we really need to discuss among men who are survivors of child sexual assault because or even assault in general. Just because you're aroused doesn't mean you're enjoying the experience. It's like when a doctor hits you on the knee to see if your knee's moving correctly and your leg pops out. Like you're not enjoying that. It's a reaction to a stimuli in the environment. I guess those feelings of fear and arousal really got wired together, and wires that fire together wire together. And it's something I have to still untangle, which is not easy. After the assault happens, I just feel disgusted at myself. I told him like how bad I felt about the situation, right? And how uncomfortable it made me feel. And he told me, it's your first time having sex as opposed to feel uncomfortable. It's just me, I'm like 13, and a 13-year-old brain, I'm like, oh, I guess that makes sense. Having sex for this first time, I'm sure is uncomfortable and awkward. That cognitive dissonance, I think, really came into play of like making and the rationalizing what is happening at 13, really.
How old was he, Dave?
He was 39.
Wow.
Yeah, he was 3 times my age. There is, I guess, a part of me that I know I'll never get back because a part of me was destroyed that day and was really taken apart. I think child abuse in a way is a lot like murder because the person doesn't know what's happening to them. It changes the trajectory of their life forever. So now he's normalizing this, and I continue to see him. He continues to pick me up and take me to his house, and this goes on for 5 years. It got to the point where now he was asking me to have sex with his friends. And then I would also find other people to have sex with on my own, thinking this time would be different, right? And thinking maybe the person wouldn't. There's a lot of things, I guess, that is, complex. I think that's why it's called complex PTSD. What makes me the most angriest about this is that people knew what was going on, and that my mom and my stepfather knew that I was being sexually assaulted. They knew that I was sending pictures to older guys. My doctor knew I was doing this. My therapist knew I was doing this. My school counselor knew I was doing this. And so there were so many barriers to protect me. And so I was very much failed by the system. And nothing was reported.
How did they find out? Were you telling people that this was going on?
So like my parents looked through my phone one day, and they discovered all these messages and these pictures. It was never in the context of "Are you okay?" It was "How dare you?" It was like, "You are a monster. This is your fault. You're going to destroy the family image. I'm going to lose my license as being a teacher. Your father's going to lose his security clearance. You're going to pull this family apart. I'm being trafficked." I'm like, how is this my fault? So then I'm now internalizing, okay, this is my fault. I am a monster, like my mom puts it. And then she decides to tell my sisters, and we have this family get together, and my parents tell my sisters of what I'm doing just in case this comes to the house. So now they're scared. And so now they don't like, because I'm putting their safety in jeopardy. And so I was very much seen as the black sheep of the family. They would ground me for months at a time. The longest I was grounded for was like a year. Not having any interaction with friends at school, still really yearning for connection. The only connection I had with these people. And to me, I tell my therapist now that the reason why it's hard for me to really, I guess, name it as abuse is it wasn't as bad as I was being abused at home, because at some aspect I wanted and loved, even if it was for 10 seconds. Really knowing that even that too was abuse. Really having to unpack that, I guess, has taken a while for me, and it's something I'm still unpacking. This wasn't my fault. I think at a logical level that we all know that this isn't our fault. The emotional brain is very much telling us a different story. And I think that part of the brain really overrides the logic side sometimes. Being abused basically on all fronts, being tortured at home by being in isolation, being humiliated in front of my family. My identity was ripped to shreds by these people. And so it very much led to my suicide attempts, because I knew there wasn't a way out of this. And I really looked at myself, and I was trying to gain more language of what was happening to me. And at this point, I'm in high school. The realization came to me, I really have nowhere to go. And the only way for me out of this is to survive this for another 4 to 5 years of being abused by my family, being abused by these people. I just couldn't deal with that, which was part of the reason that, yeah, that did drive to my suicide attempts. And I guess in the hospital, if I was being abused, and I did tell them I wasn't being abused just because of like, you don't know what's going to happen. If you say yes, like, it's like, now what? Like, am I going to be put in the foster system? Like, who knows if that's going to be any better? Because we all know the foster system's not great. Is my parents going to find out? Is the abuse from my parents going to get worse because now their image is being into question? I lied and I said, no, I'm not being abused. And it was enough to convince them that I wasn't being abused. So then I get back from my hospital. No one again is ever asking, are you okay? It's, how dare you attempt suicide? You are staining the family image. You're just doing it for attention. I'm like, who commits suicide for attention? Like, please tell me, in what world does that make sense to you? I very much had my life controlled. I attempted suicide by medication. Everything, all my medication was more controlled now. I couldn't do it when I was doing medication. I had to be supervised. And I guess I didn't like that because a part of me still at that age is still feeling independent, having, your independent part of your independence being ripped from you. I guess is never a good feeling, especially when you have so little of it. The abuse from these people didn't stop. It kept going. And I was still being trafficked from these people. A lot of the times I like didn't want these people. I was too afraid to say no. And I told myself, if I let them have what I want, it'll be over sooner. That's what made sense to me. And I feel like if I said no, that I would actually be physically hurt more so than what I'm already being. Yeah, I would just dissociate into a third world I created for myself. Really, it didn't feel pain, didn't feel pleasure. It was just numb. Yeah, that's going on. So I guess that's really the main part of the abuse. For me, since I had no phone, I was totally reliant on these people. So when they would pick me up and they would take me to these motels, to their homes, I had no way of calling 911. I have no way of telling someone I'm in danger, like this person's trying to kill me. So I'm totally reliant on this person, having them to take me back home. I guess the ironic, sad part of this is that I was so afraid that I would be in trouble by my parents. Not that I was in danger. That was what I was afraid of because they very much told me that I had a choice of doing this and I'm choosing to be sex trafficked. And I'm being coerced by these people, having my mind and feelings played with. A lot of ways validate me in some ways because my parents would desecrate my body by saying stuff like, you need to lose weight, you need to work out more, go on this diet, like your thighs are too big, your voice is too feminine, your hair looks like the weatherman on the TV show. And so every part of my body was made fun of and put back together. And so having these adults telling me that I look nice, that I look attractive, that my legs do look good was very much almost like a high because it's like, oh, like I am good enough, at least to these people. Yeah, it's a lot of where a lot of this is complex in a lot of ways.
David, it goes without saying that this is all horrific, unbelievable almost. I do believe it, but it's not something that most people hear about or confront. And for you to have endured that and come to the point where you're now on this path to getting your master's degree and you are able to sit and talk to me, and I know you've been on Jan Broberg's podcast also. And for those who don't know, David and I were part of a men's survivor roundtable on the Jan Broberg show not too many months ago. And that is in fact how I met David, was through Jan Broberg and her Thrivivors organization. It's commendable and so powerful for you to be able to sit here with me and talk about all of this. But it also begs the question, how did you get to this point? How were you able to survive that and understand or get to the point where you understood what was going on and sought some sort of recovery?
It's a good question. I'm still asking myself that. How did I survive? When I eventually turned 21, I cried really because I thought by the time I was 21, I was going to be found in a ditch or in a motel dead. And the fact that I wasn't found in a ditch, it's such an emotion I really don't even know how to describe. I've always had that fighter spirit in me. I want to live. And I think that really kept me alive for a while. And I think honestly, dissociating was big part of my childhood. And it's something that I am still combating with. I always knew something was wrong about the family. Let's just say that I knew that this wasn't on some level normal because of how painful it was and how you're supposed to love your children. And I didn't feel loved. I felt hated. I think that awareness is what allowed me to, I call it awakening from really the spell you're put under by the abuse. For me, I was entering a series of relationships trying to fill the void of my parents. These were not healthy relationships by any means. They were very abusive, very manipulative. Some relationships, I was being physically assaulted, I was being degraded emotionally. And I kept telling myself, I keep dating the same people, they just have different faces. And I never understood why. I think the last relationship I had really put the nail on the coffin because he very much reenacted my childhood and he knew my vulnerabilities and he played on them. He would hang the phone up in the middle of a conversation and block me so I wouldn't be able to call him back, not be able to talk to him for like 24 to 48 hours until like he's then now calling me and like acting like nothing ever happened, like starting these arguments out of nothing and me having to keep giving and giving and giving and submitting and collapsing. Part of the freeze response, submit and collapse, and not have a voice really. When he left, I really put the nail in the coffin because I was like, why do I keep dating these people? And then I found this amazing person called Dr. Romney, and I was like, narcissism, what on earth is that? Learning about narcissism. And I was like, holy cow, this is my childhood. This is my parents. These are my caregivers. They're narcissists. They have so little empathy. All they care about is themselves. They act like they're confident, but they have the smallest threshold for any criticism. They would suck up all of the air in the room and everything had to be on them. And they're very charming people, very manipulative. I was like, okay, well, this isn't me. This is my parents. And I think getting to where I am now, it was not easy. I had to sacrifice a lot of things. I remember telling my friend one day, I'm so miserable in my life right now. Nothing makes me happy because I'm still being abused by my parents, even into my 20s. I told her, I'm going to graduate within a year and I don't care how hard it's going to be. I'm going to graduate. And I took 49 credits within a year. And while doing research, and graduated within 3 years of college instead of the normal four. Went no contact with my parents. I haven't spoke to them in a while now. For me, I knew there was nothing I could do to change this relationship. And that's the relationship. I was going to stay in it, accept that this relationship is never going to change and stay in it for the sake of having something familiar to me. Or I could leave, which is the much harder path, and do this a lot on my own at a young age because I'm still young. I chose the harder path. I couldn't keep living like this. I survived the abuse, but a lot was taken from me and having to deal with the residual aftermath, almost like the whiplash effect. Now you're out of it, but now you're having to pick up the pieces that was shattered for so long. I eventually was infected with HIV. So having to deal with that has not been easy, knowing that someone is in me for like the rest of my life. And it wasn't by choice either. Like not saying that people go out to get HIV by choice. The fact that it happened in an event that was so horrific because even though I turned 18, these patterns were still happening where I was still going out to people like I could now drive at this point. So now I was going to their houses and having sex and still trying to feel validated and still trying to feel connection with people. That really never stopped until I got older into my 20s. I would say that went on for 2.5 years after I was 20. There's that part and really, I guess, wanting to make my life better. Honestly, I was in so much pain There were some nights where I was just like crying on the floor. I felt like someone was torturing my soul almost, and wanting to get better, wanting to take control of my life. I think really pushed me to learn and really empower myself, which honestly has been more healing, the psychoeducation of it, than the therapy itself, because in a way you're taking back your power and you're learning what happened to you. I would still say that healing is always a journey, it's never a destination. Because I don't think there's any point in someone's life where they're not going to be healing from this. I think part of the grief really is because this, for better or worse, what happened is a part of you because it did shape your upbringing. When it happens to you for so long, when you're so young, when you know your brain is rapidly developing, it's hard to say that's not a part of you.
What does your support system look like today?
It's still very limited. I'm in therapy. I have a few close friends. I would say the isolation really has done a number on me because never really gaining that muscle to maintain a relationship and cultivate that relationship. And most of my friendships have really been one-sided because that's what I was told and mirrored by my parents, that relationships are one-sided. It's definitely not easy being young, that's for sure. I guess I try to really get comfortable with being alone because I know you're not always going to have someone in your life. I think it took me a while to feel comfortable being by myself because I am anxiously attached. And once I finally got to that place of, okay, I'm good to be alone, it's like, okay, how can I be efficient? I'm really being good on my own, not in like I don't need any connection, but like, how can I not depend on someone else in a sense of needing to provide for me? I think it's a really fine line of being hyper independent and allowing people in because still navigating that. And I think what really motivated me to tell my story is that a lot of the healing that I would listen to was listening to podcasts like this and hearing people's stories. There are not being a lot of stories about men. The vast majority was happening to women, and just it happens disproportionately to women than it does to men, but it's still, I think, more common than people would like to admit that it happens to men because men don't like to talk about it for a variety of reasons. That really bothered me. Really wanted to start the conversation in men's mental health and start breaking the stigma of sexual abuse because abuse doesn't discriminate. And something that I mentioned before is I think boys unfortunately make the perfect victims to perpetrators because they know that the likelihood of them ever telling someone is really small. I think if we're going to tackle sexual abuse, we need to do it with both men and women, not just women. A large amount of studies on sexual abuse have been with women. I just recently was took part of a seminar on dealing with trauma. I think as we get through the years, I think more and more people are starting to recognize and accept that sex abuse happens to men, but I think the stigma is another issue that's long lasting and it needs to be broken for sure. Like I told my therapist, I know how it feels to be that little boy and being so alone and not having anyone to support you and feeling like you're an alien because I was that boy for a while. You know, really wanting to push men's mental health because a lot of abuse shows up as substance abuse, shows up as men cheating on their partners, shows up in addiction, and because men in essence have to bottle up their emotions, and anything that you really bottle up is going to spill out in some aspect in your life. I full-heartedly believe that child abuse needs to have a better conversation among people because I even think just child abuse in general is really taboo and people don't want to talk about it because it makes them uncomfortable. And so no change really happens. And the only time change will ever happen is when people start having conversations that make them uncomfortable.
David, I think what you're doing is extremely powerful and courageous. But I also wonder where you see yourself in a year, 3 years, 5 years down the road, based on your desires to heal and how this support system and the therapy and the being willing to tell your story, how that's all impacting how you see your future.
I would say I try not to plan for the future too much because I know and nothing really goes according to plan in life, even for the best of circumstances. So I would say really taking it day by day and living the moment, I think has been a big thing for me because I've been so preoccupied wishing my life away when I was younger of having to get out of the abuse. And I guess really sitting in the moment, feeling the world around me has been hard, but it has allowed me to really start making a rich and meaningful life. I feel telling my story adds purpose. It makes it feel like the abuse wasn't for nothing. That something, knowing that something good can come out of this horrible story, I think is so impactful. Being able to create change that needs to really happen. I think a lot of people are afraid to tell their story. For me, I've always been on some level like, take me as you see me, either accept me or don't. It's hard not to say that other people's opinions don't impact you, but I try to not let it because I know there's much more good that will happen from telling your story than bad will come of it. And the people who don't support you with your story aren't really meant to be in your life to begin with. Where I really see myself in, I would say, a year, is very difficult because I never thought I would be telling my story like this a year from now. I guess, yeah, I'm just taking where one step takes me at this point and being able to work with other survivors. I'm not a licensed psychologist by any means, but being able to hear other people's stories and work with other survivors has really been impactful and cathartic. Being able to hear their story and knowing you're not the only one and being able to tell your story, because I feel like no one is ever really going to understand you other than people who have gone through it themselves and know what it's like to be in the trenches and know how isolating it can get.
After you described how you were brought up and the circumstances surrounding your emotional state, as well as your physical state, being brought up in that household, being constantly, as you put it, tortured, it's, I think, an ideal word for what you experienced. It would seem to me that you would not have the ability to feel a sense of pride, because I certainly don't think that I heard you describe that as being a part of your growing up years. But yet I look at what you're doing right now, sitting with me and talking about this and how you graduated in 3 years instead of 4 and how you're working on a master's degree. I'm hoping that you feel a sense of pride and that you feel a sense of accomplishment. Is that something that you are capable emotionally of feeling, and do you feel that pride?
I would say I am being able to feel proud of the accomplishments I have done. Something that I've talked to with my grandma, my dad said really is to make a list of all the accomplishments I have made, because I think it's so easy when you're in survival mode to just take it step by step and you forget along the way of how much you actually accomplished. Yeah, graduating 3 years for me was one of my proudest moments. Being also I have a learning disability and having to navigate professors, telling me that I wouldn't make it in STEM, being able to walk down the aisle and get that piece of paper and graduate ahead of my friends really, I guess, gave me the confidence I needed to know that I am doing something right. I would say feeling is, I guess, a new thing for me. I've always felt, but being able to identify with those feelings. I remember what one of my RAs in my first freshman year of college told me, and really is what dropped the seed into me healing from all of this. She said something so small, but to me it was so impactful. I was having a conversation with her, and she told me that your feelings are valid. And no one's ever told me in my life my feelings are valid. And when I heard that, I was like, she is so weird. Why would she say my feelings are valid? It really caused me to pause and really think. And I was like, well, that's different, because I was always told by my parents, you're not allowed to feel that way. Or I've done X, Y, and Z for you. Like, you should be grateful for how much I've done for you. And I'm like, providing a child food and shelter is the very bare minimum of being a parent. It's as much as of what an orphanage would do for you. That's not something to be proud of as a parent. For me, still going on it with my parents, I will say my parents have tracked me down to where I live. And instead of writing me a letter of how sorry they are for all the damage they have caused and wanting to talk, they had an attorney write me, trying to threaten me with defamation of trying to defame their image. And when I held that piece of paper, the blood in my body just dropped in the sense of betrayal in that letter. Because I was like, not only do I have, I'm like, I'm not making this up anymore. I actually have physical proof. My parents don't give two hoots about me. Because who tries to sue their child for defamation? I've had to hire an attorney and deal with all of that mess. It was really just an intimidation tactic to scare me into silence because they can't really stop someone from telling their story. And I don't use their name because their names aren't important to my story. And so for me, it's definitely opened a whole nother can of worms for me receiving that letter, as I think of it would for anyone. If anything, this just proves more to my story that it was actually that bad, because no parent who loves their child will ever try to sue them for trying to defame their name about abuse that they did to their kids. Like, that doesn't even make sense.
Yeah, I agree. Totally. I think we could talk all day about all of this. It sounds like you've barely scratched the surface as to the torment and horrific experiences that you suffered through. But because of the fact that we don't have that kind of time, I would like to discuss a little bit, if I could, with you about what you'll do after this interview is over. How do you deal with those memories that have now been brought to the forefront of your mind? How do you deal with maybe some implicit memories that you didn't know were there but may come up as a result of having talked about this? What will you do to take care of yourself?
No, that is a very good question. And I don't think it's a question anyone has ever asked me out of all the interviews I've done. So I can definitely tell you're very trauma informed. I would say every time I tell my story, it gets a little easier. And being able to recenter myself takes a little less time than the last. I don't shame myself for the emotions that come up, because nothing ever good will ever come from shaming yourself. Like, it will only inhibit you. And so really practicing that self-compassion and mindfulness has been a huge part of my healing journey, and being able to be empathic towards myself and giving myself the time that I actually need to heal. I would say anytime someone tells their story, it feels like all of your energy has just been zapped out of you. And I don't think that ever really goes away. But I try to do something that is nostalgic. And I know it might be, how does he have something that's nostalgic from all of his life? And there were moments that I did feel safe. And I think I dissociated a lot into video games and living in an alternate universe and watching these TV shows that had superpowers to them, as I felt power that I had control. I would say doing something nostalgic is a very powerful emotion and is one of the quickest ways to get you out of an episode of depression. And being able to feel that safety as you did back then, you do now.
Yeah, that's great. I think I especially like hearing your understanding of what it means to shame yourself and how to avoid that. From everything I've read, what you said just now really hits the nail on the head with regard to taking care of yourself if you are starting to feel shamed. And that is that compassion to yourself, being empathic to yourself, and being mindful. I think mindfulness is so powerful. I wish more people knew what it meant to practice mindfulness. So if you're listening and don't know what that means or haven't experienced it, I strongly encourage you to do even some simple research. Google it. But by all means, take care of yourself and be compassionate and empathic to yourself. As you mentioned, David, I think that's so powerful. And the things that you mentioned that you would follow up with after this, I think are excellent. I'm going to say it again. I think you are to be commended for having the courage and strength and fortitude to sit here with me for the last hour or so and talk about your experiences. So thank you very much for being with me and for sharing all of this with the audience in a way that I think you mentioned at the very beginning, that your hope is that this will be helpful to someone. I would definitely look forward to having you on again and doing some follow-up with you to see where you're at and hear that you've accomplished that master's degree and that you're working on helping others in a continuing way, because I know this is going to help a lot of people. So thank you.
Thank you. It's always a gift to tell my story and being able to help others. I love sharing psychoeducation. I think education is meant to be shared, and tidbits of what has helped me over the years and what has helped me to other people.
Thank you, David. Let's stay in touch and talk again soon.
Thank you.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. My deep appreciation and admiration go out to David Weeks. He has shared with us some extremely intense and brutal abuses he endured, yet has also shown intense fortitude through overcoming some of the most intense and difficult experiences anyone could ever hope to endure. And he did it with an amazing attitude and determination that makes him an example for us all. David is the type of person that I truly admire. Someone who overcomes intense fears, abuses, and malevolence at some of the highest levels life can throw at us. And he's someone who shares kindness, information, and inspiration in spite of all he has endured. Thank you, David, for the time and energy you gave us by guesting on this show. You are a remarkable individual. I also want to thank each of you who have taken the time to listen to this episode. I appreciate you being here and would also appreciate your subscription, rating, and sharing of this podcast. It all helps the show grow. Please remember to also do your part to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. One of the best ways to do this is to start by believing when it comes to listening to and supporting a victim of rape and sexual assault when they are sharing their experience. Please join me again next week when I bring you another guest on Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. We'll see you next week.